Canada's 43rd Parliament is now in session. It's been a day full of pomp and ceremony. And policy, a chance for the government to lay out its agenda.
It is a mandate to fight climate change, strengthen the middle class, walk the road of reconciliation, keep Canadians safe and healthy, and position Canada for success in an uncertain world.
But in this minority, the government also needs to reach enough members from the opposition benches.
We are very disappointed in this throne speech.
I'm going to support the speech because I see in that speech many opportunities.
We need to talk because it's not good enough.
So what kind of message did this speech from the throne send, and what does it signal about the road ahead? It's been a busy day for At Issue, but they are back with us again now to decipher a little bit that throne speech. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne is in Toronto, and Aaron Wherry is in Ottawa, although inside, lucky him. Okay, let's just maybe get sort of your general take on whether whether it sent the right message, I guess, to Canadians and to the other parties, the opposition parties. Chantal?
I think that voters who supported the Liberals will find that this is the throne speech that they expected. I suspect many voters, notwithstanding the criticism from the NDP, will find that there's a lot there that could eventually be interesting. And the Bloc Québécois has cut to the chase and decided that while nothing is perfect, it can support the throne speech. So cutting any possibility of a psychodrama on Parliament Hill, on the survival of the government, but also cutting the grass from under the feet of the NDP, whose leader, Jagmeet Singh, seemed to think that he was going to be negotiating with the government over the throne speech. I don't think that's going to happen.
It isn't. Okay, so Andrew, that to me sounds like the government sort of did what it needed to do, but I know that there are parts that were left out, parts of the country that felt left out already as well.
Sure. I mean, you wouldn't be surprised by the contents of this, given the Liberal platform. Their aim is to round up the progressive vote that got away from them in the last election, or enough of it did to deprive them of a majority. So that's what they're going to do. If you were concerned, as many people are, about the divisions within the country, particularly in Western Canada, over the climate issue and over the oil issue, there were certainly precious little reach out to those kinds of voters. Maybe less than maybe perhaps people had expected. But this is a government that is focused entirely on getting its majority, and it frankly doesn't need Alberta and Saskatchewan to get there.
Okay, Aaron, your take on whether it did the things the government needed it to do. I mean, obviously, it sounds like it's going to survive. So from that perspective, it did.
Yeah, I mean, it avoided, I guess, the problem of sort of falling into any major troubles or you know, a sentence here or there that would have really inflamed tensions or you know, rounded up the opposition parties to vote against them. I think they laid out a fair amount of territory here where you can see them working with the Bloc or working with the NDP to pass legislation. A few spots maybe on tax measures that maybe the Conservatives can work with, but I think this was maybe best understood as sort of setting the table in terms of where things are going to go, and now it comes down to sort of the details of exactly where and exactly how you do these things.
So the one thing everyone agreed on during the special was that you had never heard so much about climate change in a speech before. How significant is that, and what does that tell Canadians about, if anything, about how serious the government is about pushing harder on that front, Chantal?
Well, the devil will be in the details, but certainly for the space devoted to the issue, it jives with the fact that about 2/3 of voters supported parties that want or promise more action on climate change, and that was reflected in the speech from the throne. Remember, minority rule plays both ways. The government needs to survive, but the opposition parties need to justify why they can't support the government. Yes. Today we saw one party, the Bloc, decide that its voters would probably think it was more reasonable to support this than not. The NDP came to a different decision. Time will tell whether one or the other was wrong.
Andrew.
Well, the NDP may have come to that decision because the Bloc came to its decision.
Yes, that's right.
Or
Once
in
you
the
know you're
reverse,
not gonna be bringing the
because
government down.
it may have believed it could negotiate more.
Yes, yes.
Yes, but also, as I say, once you know the government's not going down, then you're kind of free to say, well, we
That's
can't
right.
possibly support this,
Right.
this thing. So we saw a lot of this game playing, of course, during the Harper minorities, when you've got three parties that all have to pull the lever at the same time to bring the government down. One or more of them always finds an excuse, particularly when they're not looking good in the polls. So nobody's interested in provoking an election just now, and you can see the government's in a strong position that way. We didn't hear a great deal of specifics about what it's going to do on the climate change file, as we didn't during the election. We've got this nice target of the net zero by 2050, but not much in the way of a roadmap of how to get there, not much of no clear on exactly what they're going to do on carbon pricing, where they're going to go, how high they're going to raise the price, that kind of thing. Perhaps we'll hear that later.
And,
I do think.
Aaron?
I just want to say that I do think it's a measure of how far this issue has come. If you go back just 6 years, which now seems like a lifetime ago, to the final 2 years of the Harper government, their last throne speech didn't mention climate change. There was one sentence, buried deep in what was a 7,000-word throne speech about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but it was by no means a focus. And even if you go back to 2015 with the Trudeau government's first throne speech, the environment and climate change were in there, but it was the third topic, and first and foremost was that issue of the middle class and ensuring economic security. So the fact that the Liberals put it front and center, I mean, I think that is a nod to where this Parliament can find common ground.
What you didn't hear, of course, was any mention seriously about the deficit. There was a line about responsible fiscal plan, so that's disappeared off the radar. Maybe that's fair enough for now. But what more seriously is there's no mention here about how to raise productivity, how to get a faster economic growth track. That is absolutely serious when you combine that with the aging of the population. The costs that represented, the slowing economic growth that represents for years and decades to come is as serious a challenge, in my view, as climate change for this country, and it's getting a fraction of the attention.
Chantal.
To go back to climate change, but link it with the economy, the Liberals rightly, I think, see that voters now have a litmus test on being serious on climate change, and they see that the Conservatives are not moving on it, and as long as the Conservatives give them that advantage, they want to build on it. But what if the economy starts slowing down and things become a lot less rosy? Will the public's commitment to the climate change issue remain as strong? Or will it do what happened at the tail end of the 2008 campaign when the fiscal global crisis hit and suddenly Stéphane Dion's green shift was wiped away completely by realities on the economic front? I'm curious about that and how it plays out over the next 2 years.
Well, I guess that speaks to what Aaron's saying. How much has public opinion moved over the past, 6 years or more on it, and how much are people willing to do? Can we spend 1 minute just sort of talking about the Conservative reaction? There wasn't a lot there, but Andrew Scheer was happy to talk about something other than himself, I think, and said that he was disappointed that there was not a lot of talk about the oil and gas sector, certainly no talk about pipelines. Does that speech do anything for him, for the Conservative Party in terms of how they have to move forward over the next at least couple of weeks? Andrew?
Well, I think he had to speak to that. It was a significant omission in the speech. He's representing a lot of people who are particularly interested in that. I get that the Tories have to reach out beyond that base and build that base in the future, but I think for today, that was probably the biggest takeaway for a conservative-minded voter was the lack, and particularly for a Western voter, was the lack of outreach to the West. I don't fault him for that. I think he had to.
Sure. Aaron?
Yeah, it felt to me today like Parliament coming back. The throne speech was it almost felt like the government throwing Andrew Scheer a bit of a lifesaver. He's had a month and a half now of answering questions nonstop about himself and his own leadership, and now he finally gets to sort of direct some scorn at other people. That said, it did still feel like his reaction was as much about sort of preserving his own leadership, still running to be prime minister, as it was about the shortcomings in the speech. And I think that's fine for the short term. I do think he has to focus on getting through the April leadership review, and he's got to play to the issues that will help him in that regard. But it is still short term thinking. How he expands that into a general election message, I think, is a question if he's still here in May.
And it only plays to solidifying what he already has, but it continues to get in the way of expanding that tent. If he is serious about believing this parliament won't last for too long, and he's going to use 6 months to kind of bake into his persona pipelines, because he needs to speak to the people who voted for him, that puts the party in a very poor position to go in another election in the short term.
Okay, so I only have about a minute left, but is this sort of the right way to start the second mandate with a minority government? Were the right kinds of signals sent, Andrew, or do we really have to wait and see what the follow-up is, where the action is?
It depends what you mean by right. If you're talking about the
I guess keeping people happy, I don't know, keeping yourself alive politically.
If you're talking about the political interests of the government, yes. They had to make sure that they cover off their left flank. That's where the votes are for them. That's where their concern is. To the extent that they're all at all concerned, I don't think they're that concerned right now about an election anytime soon. But they had to, their long-term ambition is to solidify that vote in the left that got fragmented in 2019. And this is certainly the first step in that process.
Chantal?
I'm guessing by doing things right, you also mean that the voters who supported the Liberals see a Trump speech that looks like what they expected from the party they voted for. I think the answer would be yes, and I think that does matter.
20 seconds to you, Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that throne speeches necessarily guarantee you much going forward, but I think I think they at least sort of established that they have an agenda they want to pursue, and they left some room open to working with the opposition, and they've, hopefully at least built up a little bit of momentum in the short term. But, by next week we'll be talking about real measures that they're putting in front of the House, and the conversation will move on pretty quickly, I think.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thanks for doing extra triple duty, as it were, today. I appreciate it. Andrew, Chantal, and Aaron. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast. Look for it on iTunes and a major podcast app. Our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.